you want to go to Cambridge University, you actually can. So let's get into some of these myths and let's bust them with reality.
I had a wonderful time when I was at Cambridge, but there were too few faces that looked like mine. That is why getting Cambridge is important. We'll build representation and we will no longer be the exception to the rule. We will provide many exceptions and we will be exceptional.
Attending Cambridge as a young Afro-Caribbean student, I initially had my own apprehensions. I thought, what if I don't fit in? What if this place isn't for me? There's nobody here who understands where I'm coming from or looks like me. I couldn't have been further from the truth.
I read about some young ethnic minority students considering universities and dismissing Cambridge as it isn't for people like us. Well, I was someone like them. My parents came to the UK from India in the 1960s with next to nothing, and I loved my time at Cambridge, so I felt I had to do something to dispel that myth.
Coming to Cambridge changed my life for the better. I didn't know it at the time, but years before I came, generous and brave people fought for women to have access to the university, and I was a beneficiary of that. Get in gives me an opportunity to do something similar for the next generation.
As Nelson Mandela said, education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. I benefited enormously from my own time at Cambridge. Get in will allow a new generation of students from disadvantaged and diverse communities to come to Cambridge.
I have wonderful memories of my time at Cambridge. Although there weren't that many people of my background here, my experience was overwhelmingly positive. Not just in the academic aspects, but also in the lifelong friendships that I made, and in the sense of being part of the college and the university community.
For me, if just one more student went to Cambridge last October as a result of the initial Get In campaign, then it's made a real difference.
Being at Cambridge gives you the chance to really be yourself, connect with like-minded people, and develop stronger ties with your cultural identity.
Hello, I'm Stephen Toop, and it's my great honor to serve as Vice Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the launch of the next phase of Get In, a project that's really close to my heart. Today's event features a discussion, followed by questions and answers with former Minister for Universities, Sam Gyimah. I will then speak with a panel of 4 Cambridge students and alumni. Cambridge is, and has been for centuries, one of the greatest centers of learning in the world. It's an institution steeped in tradition, with its present entrenched in its past. It's a place I love with every fiber of my being, and yet I'm among the first to admit that Cambridge is not perfect, and that sometimes our quirky traditions and our carved stone walls have inhibited progression and created a perception of exclusivity. As Maya Angelou once said, you can't really know where you are until you know where you've been. In 2018, among Cambridge's cohort of 2,574 British undergraduates, only 61 were Black. It was a statistic of which no one could be proud. Talent and intelligence are not bound up in the color of a person's skin, nor in the socioeconomic status of their family. It stands to reason that Cambridge cohorts should mirror the demographics of the broader UK community. Clever students from ethnic minority groups were patently not coming to Cambridge in sufficient numbers. How many brilliant minds, ideas, collaborations were we missing? How many discoveries were not being made because students of great potential and tenacity were simply not studying here? How many talented individuals were not going on to leadership, locally, nationally, globally, because they'd not received the education they deserved? Maya Angelou, we know, was a very wise woman. She also said, if you don't like something, change it. Get In is part of our work addressing underrepresentation of ethnic minority students at Cambridge. It began as a series of videos made by some of our Black students, encouraging their peers to imagine themselves at Cambridge, encouraging them to believe that there's a place here for those who do not come from white middle-class backgrounds. If you can see someone like yourself in a particular place or role, you too can aspire to be there. You too can get in. Now, those videos have reached more than 1.5 million people. And we're profoundly grateful to the students who stepped up to talk about their lives at Cambridge and how they got here. Our social media campaign gained traction in parallel with a generous gift from the grime artist Stormzy. Stormzy's very public support for Black students to study at Cambridge certainly inspired interest, and the scholarships funded enabled students to come here. There's no doubt that our Get In campaign and the very existence of the Stormzy scholarships have made a substantial difference. Numbers of applications from members of the Black British community increased dramatically. In 2019, numbers of Black students went up by 50%, and by 2020, with 137 Black students admitted, we had more than doubled the number in 2 years. Now that makes me proud of Cambridge. Should we maintain this trajectory, we're well on track for our numbers of Black undergraduates to reflect the percentage of Black students studying for their A-levels. But we want Get In to do more. We want Cambridge to do more. Our most underrepresented UK cohorts are students of Pakistani and Bangladeshi ethnicity. So we've expanded the program to reach out to members of the Pakistani and Bangladeshi communities and to demonstrate that there is a place for all here at Cambridge. And we've recognized that one of the greatest barriers to thriving here is money. We're incredibly grateful to Get In supporters who are enabling us to remove these barriers by funding Get In participation awards for undergraduates and Get In awards for master's students. These awards bridge affordability gaps, enabling students to excel with far less financial stress. This year, and for at least the next 5 years, we have up to 10 awards to offer for underrepresented and disadvantaged master's students and up to 20 undergraduates. Thank you to those who have made this possible. We're taking genuine strides towards a Cambridge where not only are all talented students welcome, but where they know that they're welcome. Because, to quote Ms. Angelou once more, when you know you are of worth, not asking it, but knowing it, you walk into a room with a particular power. And that power, well, it's the potential to change the world. Friends, I now welcome Sam Gyimah, former Minister for Universities and a keen advocate for equity in education. Sam, thanks so much for joining us. It's really kind of you. You spent much of your schooling in Ghana. What made you aspire to study at Oxford, and what barriers did you face?
Thank you, Stephen, and congratulations on the progress that you've made. I think it's very impressive progress you've made in admitting students from underprivileged backgrounds. In terms of my own experience, which your question relates to, I was born in the UK, but grew up in Ghana. So most of my schooling was in Ghana and then finished my studies here. I mean, Oxbridge is a global brand. I was aware of the brand. And I was doing well at school and wanted to challenge myself. I was in a fortunate position that having grown up in a country where being Black was in the majority, I never considered that I wouldn't fit in, because I was used to being in a majority culture, but then suddenly found myself in a situation where I was in the minority, although I didn't have all the hang-ups that someone who had been to school in this country would have about applying. But the most challenging aspect was actually navigating the system. And you said what made me apply to Oxford. For a start, I didn't realize you couldn't apply to both at the same time. You've got different entrance exams. Have you done the right subjects for what you want to study? Who's going to prepare you for those exams if you are especially from the state system? So if you come from an underprivileged background or a background where this is not usual, thinking 2 steps ahead to actually plot your way through the thicket of the application process to succeed can be very challenging. I was very fortunate to have my history teacher who volunteered his time to prepare me for the exam and support me. But that was extreme fortune. If you think of getting into Oxford or Cambridge as an athletics event, these are academic athletes. You've got some athletes who are training from the age of 7. They do the 7+, they do the 11+ or the 13+, they do GCSEs to peak at the age of 18 when they apply. If you thought about it just a year before, you're already very far behind. And that was the barrier I faced, how to navigate and actually get myself prepared to be even competitive and credible as an applicant.
And yet, of course, getting in is only the beginning of what can be a pretty complicated set of demands on people who haven't, as you put it, been sort of training for this since they were 7 years old. I gather that when you got to Oxford, you also experienced some economic barriers in terms of remaining in the program. And tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so I managed to get in, and then the support that I needed wasn't forthcoming from family for a whole number of reasons. And I was overdue in my rent, and the bursar cornered me one day and said, if you haven't paid this, we have to throw you out of the college. And it's the first and most successful negotiation I did. I managed to persuade him to turn my rent into a loan, which I paid when I graduated. And ever since then, I've been supportive of Somerville College because of their generosity and understanding of my position. But not only did that allow me to stay on, it also gave me the freedom while I was at Oxford to pursue debating. I became president of the Oxford Union, and I suspect I wouldn't have become a politician or got elected into Parliament but for those experiences. So as I think you rightly put it, getting in is one thing, getting on is another thing. And I needed that support in order to get on and to make the most of the experience. My university was a defining moment in my life, and it wouldn't have been that defining and set me up for the career I've had if I hadn't been able to participate in the full extent of the life at university. And I think that applies to Cambridge as well.
Sure, it does. And I think we heard some of that from the people who spoke in the video at the beginning, that same sense that there was a defining set of moments in these experiences that set them up, as you say, for the rest of life. One of the things that seems to be a challenge sometimes for students who come from different backgrounds into a place like Cambridge is this idea that they don't see themselves. So there's this underrepresentation that can be really challenging for people. We talked about the 50% year-on-year increase of Black students here. This is great, for the first year, for the entry class. But for those that, who've been in for 2 or 3 years, it's still the case that they don't see many people like them. Was that something that struck you when you were at Oxford? Did it matter to you that there weren't many other or as many Black students around as there would be now?
It does matter. At one level, when you get to Oxford or Cambridge, you find intellectual peers, and if you're, no matter how obscure your academic interest is, you'll find someone who shares that interest. If you're interested in 15th century eunuchs, there'll be someone who shares that interest. So there is a unity around that, but socially fitting in can be a challenge. And I've mentored a young man who very well educated in the UK, who was applying to do engineering and nearly didn't apply to Cambridge. This is just last year, because he thought he wouldn't fit in and he would rather apply to one of the London universities. Persuaded him to, he successfully did, and he's going to be studying engineering at Cambridge last year. But so I think the underrepresentation is a real factor for a lot of people, smart people, in choosing whether or not to study at Cambridge. But there is a broader aspect to it. It's not just underrepresentation. It's having an inclusive culture where people from different cultures feel the university caters to not just their intellectual, but their emotional needs. But more importantly, beyond that, Cambridge is also a pipeline for talent. And I liked what you said in your introductory remarks, that many people who leave Cambridge go on to lead organizations and be leaders in society. And if there is going to be a pipeline of talent that is not just diverse for social justice reasons, but actually brings the best in terms of problem solving, decision making that you need at the top of organizations, then Cambridge has got to play its part. And one finance chief executive said to me, they could quadruple the pipeline and we will still need more. That just tells you the scale of the task ahead in terms of underrepresentation. So it's not just at Cambridge, but it's also what happens post-Cambridge. And I would also finally say, I remember Yale Chief David Svensson talking about their own investments and the pressure they're under to make sure that they are invested in companies that, are climate compliant, that are diverse, and they're putting pressure on asset managers to be diverse. And if Cambridge is going to have to do that, then Cambridge needs to have its own house in order. So I think the issue of underrepresentation and resolving it is a non-negotiable one for a global institution with a brand that Cambridge has.
Brilliantly stated. I couldn't agree with you more, Sam. And I will say that this question of ensuring an inclusive culture is absolutely central to what we're thinking about over the course of the next few years. We are just about to create a Black student hub to give further support for students when they're here. It's not, of course, meant to be exclusive, but it's meant to note that there are particular challenges and that there needs to be sometimes just a place for people to get some extra assistance to navigate through what can be a really complicated system for people. So that's an example. And your point about working with asset managers, that is something that we are doing through the Cambridge University Endowment Fund. And you're right that we can't stand up and challenge others if we're not doing what we speak of ourselves. I think it's so important. This question, though, of representation, I do want to pursue one further element on it because it doesn't end. You get into university and then all of a sudden you find yourself in a career. You wrote a wonderful piece in the Sunday Times over the weekend, and you started with an anecdote where you mentioned that even as sitting on the front bench in the Commons, you were once mistaken as a driver by a colleague. Just how do you react to that, and how do you deal with what can feel, I think, like a somewhat minimizing sense of your own achievement in some ways? How do you respond?
Well, you develop ways of coping, as we all do, and you learn to deflect. You learn to smile when rather than, because you don't want to be the angry Black man. It's so that's how you deal with it. But I like what I think it was Ian Drayton who has been supportive of this program, and I know quite well what he said in the video, which is you want a situation where it is not remarkable that you are a Black man on the front bench of the British House of Commons, or you are a Black man studying mathematics at Cambridge, or a Black man having a senior role in any of the leading professions. I think that is where we want to get to. And I think the other point I would say there is that and I said this in my article, that this is what it means to live in a modern society. I think 10 years from now, people would look back and wonder even that we are having these debates. And this is not woke. I think this is about making sure that our institutions not just reflect our society, but we are harnessing the best of the talent that is available to solve what are increasingly very complex problems. And to those that say that, what about white working class? I say addressing this issue and addressing the needs of white working class boys or other communities should not be a zero-sum game.
Couldn't agree more. And it seems to me that we know from research more and more that diversity does actually lead to better decision making in all organizations. I mean, there's a lot of research in the corporate world, there's research in universities that shows that. And it is diversity of the widest sort, intellectual diversity as well as racial diversity, hugely important. And I agree, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a competition for access. It is that a place like Cambridge has to be accessible to all people of talent wherever they're found, it seems to me. One of the key elements in Get in this new phase is supporting students who are pursuing master's programs. Tell me a little bit about your thoughts on postgraduate education and disadvantaged communities, because it's not something that's received as much attention, I think, as undergraduate education.
No, I think it's very important and right that you have focused on that as part of this program. When I was universities minister, one of the things that I was looking at is you're looking at the numbers, and now roughly 1 in 2, if you take the UK, of students would have a bachelor's degree. And so the bachelor's degree today is not as differentiating as it was 30 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to be at the top of your game, you end up realizing that you've got to then do a master's, or in some cases an MBA, depending on what your chosen line of profession is. And there is a real risk that now that students share in the cost of their education, that you end up with a 2-tier system where disadvantaged students are so concerned about the debt from their undergraduate degree that they just want to get into the workforce to be able to pay that back and don't want to take on any further study. And that would be could put them at a disadvantage further on in their careers, where others that are well off don't just have the first degree, they have a second degree, they have an MBA, they've studied internationally. So I think if you're really going to create a sustainable pipeline of talent that is competitive and deals with the 2-tier system that you can have, then you've got to focus on master's degrees as well. So I think it is right, if you're concerned about social mobility and really addressing some of the root causes of it, getting on extends to postgraduate study.
Look, there are lots of questions coming in, so I think I better go to those because there are some really interesting ones. One of the real challenges, and you talked about this, is inclusivity of the culture of institutions like Cambridge. Do you have any concrete suggestions about how a culture can be made to feel more inclusive from your own experience?
Harder question. And well, I would say one of the areas where that can really frustrate students as undergraduates is the sense of alienation, not feeling that you belong, not seeing other people like you. And that, coupled with financial problems, could affect people's mental health, for example, when university should be a very positive experience for students. So I would say one thing an inclusive culture does is pay attention to all those aspects of a student's life that you otherwise might not pay attention to, because post 18 you are an adult and you should be able to deal with all of these things on your own. And mental health is one example, but I think it's one thing that I do like the Cambridge Foundation degree, for example, as a way of introducing people to Cambridge and how, not just to get in, but how Cambridge life operates. It is very different to any other university. And I'm sure there are many other things you can do. The staff they deal with, the mentors they have, all of this is part of forming, creating an inclusive culture.
Yes, the foundation year program is something we're really excited about. It is designed exactly as you say to try to ensure that people who may not quite feel ready and yet are intellectually extremely gifted can be introduced in a more framed way to this rather odd place that is Cambridge, or Oxford for that matter. Someone's asked about the connection between race and class. And of course, in the United Kingdom and England, class is a particularly salient historical fact. How do you think about that relationship between race and class? And most particularly, the question says, in a sense, you can do something about visible diversity. It may be easier to address theoretically than dealing with class difference. Do you agree with that, and how would you analyze it?
It's an interesting question, and one of the first essays you have to write in an Oxford PPE, this talks about class being the basis of British politics. All else is embellishment and detail. So class is much broader than the race issue. You could have people from underrepresented groups that come from very well-off families, that are very well educated, and could get into Cambridge under their own steam. But I think the way I analyze this is to look at educational disadvantage. Mm-hmm. And educational disadvantage wherever you find it. And that cuts across race and class. So educational disadvantage, you would find it in some parts of the country where, famously Knowsley in Liverpool had one person going to university in one particular year. That is a challenge. And you'd have that also among certain, obviously, minority communities. So when you focus on educational disadvantage as an issue, and there's lots of data to deal with this, you pick up all the different groups of people. The issue to do with race in particular is just how thin the pipeline is, and how far behind some of these people are. But as I said in my earlier remarks, dealing with this doesn't mean that dealing with other aspects of or other groups who suffer from educational disadvantage should not be a focus. But if you look, the Financial Conduct Authority, I mentioned that because I'm in the world of finance, today is talking about diversity of senior leadership and boards of big financial institutions. The pipeline is just not there. Right. For many of these institutions, if they were willing to address the problem to the full extent that they could. And so that is the area where the least progress has been made. And that is why I think focusing on that is important. But it obviously doesn't exclude dealing with other aspects of the problem.
Yes, and it really goes to the role of a place like Cambridge, as you were saying earlier. The leadership group, it comes in part from institutions like ours, not exclusively by any means, but in part. And so if we're not playing that role, then, as you say, the pipeline just isn't going to be there for all sorts of other parts of society as well. Sam, we could go on for a long time, but I should move on to talk with our students and alumni. Thank you so much. It's really been great to hear your perspectives, and we're very grateful for your visible support of this initiative. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm going to talk now with a panel of 2 students and 2 recent graduates who are going to offer their perspectives on coming to Cambridge and what it felt like while they were here, and how we can increase representation of minority ethnic groups at Cambridge. So now I would like to welcome all of our panelists, and I think they'll be joining us. So let me introduce them briefly. Priscilla Mensa graduated from Girton in 2015 before commencing her tenure as president of the Cambridge University Students' Union, and she was the first Black woman elected to that role. Later this year, she'll commence a master's degree at Harvard's Kennedy School, focusing on social and urban policy. Ibrahim Mohammed, known as Ibs Mo, grew up in Hackney and worked to increase accessibility while he was at Wolfson, establishing his YouTube channel where he offers advice and guidance on applying to Cambridge. And we had a rather fun interview on that channel a couple of years ago. He's currently studying for an MSc in education at Oxford. Zainab Ahmed is in her final year of classics at Newnham, and she takes part in a number of extracurricular activities, including drama and coxing, and finds her volunteer access and outreach work particularly fulfilling. And like Zainab, Israel Shita enjoys encouraging potential Cambridge applicants when he isn't playing basketball, turning his hand to comedy, I gather increasingly, or studying maths at Fitzwilliam. Well, I'm really interested, of course, in hearing about how each of you came here. Let's start with Priscilla. What was it that inspired you to apply to study at the University of Cambridge?
Well, thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and it's great to be with all of you today. For me, that question is a really easy one to answer. I was chosen, I begged to be part of an insight day to Cambridge. And during my insight day, I decided that I wanted to go to university and I wanted to go to Cambridge in particular. So it was really that opportunity. Had I not gone on that gifted and talented trip that my school had run, I don't know if I would have really taken any time to think about university as an option, let alone Cambridge. So for me, access initiatives are the reason I ended up where I did.
That's really interesting. Does that mean that there's maybe too much luck in the system now? Because it sounds as if you hadn't pushed to beyond that, we might not be seeing you here today.
Precisely, and I think the reason why I'm so passionate about WP is that I don't want it to be down to a luck of the draw. It's not necessarily about being placed in the right place at the right time. There are so many young people who are talented who, not for lack of trying, may not have been in just the right place at just the right time and just the right class with just the right kind of inspirational teacher. And so as much as we can do to widen that pool, we should do it, because that way you're catching as many people as possible and you're not leaving these things to chance. That for me is the thing that worries me most, and why I'm so passionate about these kind of projects, because as many people as we expose the opportunities that come with Cambridge too, the more people we can get through the doors who might otherwise not have thought about it.
Ibs, if I may, tell me a little bit about your journey here. Was it something you'd thought about for a long time before you applied to come to Cambridge?
So honestly, not really. I actually applied, I would say, 3 months before the deadline. And I think mainly what's unique about my background is, I come from a Pakistani and Bangladeshi background, but I also come from a low socioeconomic background as well. And I think attending a very low performing state school was a really big factor. For me, it wasn't, myself, nor my family, nor my school had the cultural capital to support students, even motivate students, and even to create an application to Cambridge. And once I got my A-levels, after results day, only then I decided that I could actually apply, because I could physically see that I had the grades, I had the main form of characteristic, I had the academic talent. Also, my sociology teacher was a really big inspiration. So when I did apply, then the scary part happened, because when I was lucky enough to come to my interview, I think growing up in Hackney for the first time, I was surrounded by, a lot of white individuals. And when I applied to Queen's College and I went to the JCR, I saw the JCR student body and I saw that every single representative was a white student. Obviously, looking back now, I would think that's, just a representation of society. But as a student at that young age, it was quite significant for me. And then I also saw a lot of prospective students who were there for their interviews with their families. And I thought, oh, wow, there's so much, support that they have that I kind of didn't really relate to. But then what I think stood out for me was, despite all those, social backgrounds and those social difficulties, I had the academic talent and I had the passion for my subject. And when I was in that interview and I was able to speak about something that I completely was in love with, which was psychology at the time, that was when I really got to kind of see myself at Cambridge through that interview. I was lucky enough to actually get pulled to Wolfson College from Queen's. And again, that was, I think, one of the best decisions that the university could make for me. So initially it was quite difficult, but I ended up really, really enjoying my application process at the end.
Thanks very much. Zainab, I think your experience was a little bit different from your background. So just share that if you would.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what Sam was saying earlier about the intersectionality of these things, and I am very aware of the privilege that I have had growing up. So I did the 11 plus, and I was very lucky that my parents were able to afford all of that tuition and send me to a grammar school. So even before I was at secondary school, we'd been visiting Cambridge as tourists, and so I was sort of aware of Cambridge as an entity before I knew what a university actually was. And my dad says that, you know, I was about 10 or 11 and I said, I'm going to go to Cambridge. And then I actually got to sixth form and I thought, this is too much stress for me and I don't want to put myself through the process of Oxbridge. And it was because my parents knew that, so I'm applying for classics, and I think it tends to be with the humanities subjects that the best place that you can be is Cambridge. And so they said, you know, if you're applying for classics, we're fine with that, but we want you to do so at the best place. And so they pushed me and my teachers pushed me, and I was very, very lucky to have that kind of support, both from them and financially as well.
So what's interesting already is that, of course, there is no one path. And, you know, just because one's in a particular ethnic group doesn't mean that everyone has the same experience by any stretch of the imagination. Zainab, I think you might be the only person of your background studying classics. Just tell me what that's like.
I'm definitely not the only one, but we are a very, very small group. There aren't many students that identify as people of colour in classics, and so I'm one of a handful of students in my year, and it was a real struggle for me because I think I'd had a bit of a shortfall with my grades, and so when I was accepted I didn't quite believe it, and it took me a long time, you know, like the first or second year of my degree, and I even now as a finalist I still have these moments of, oh, I was only accepted because of positive discrimination. And what I actually love about doing access work is that it's an opportunity for me, as much as the people I'm talking to realize that positive discrimination isn't a thing that this university utilizes. And it gives me the opportunity to talk to other people and inspire them to realize that there are communities. I've been serving on the Bangla Society as their access and welfare officer, and it really pushed me to do more stuff. And I've just been elected to the SU as the Access, Education and Participation SAB. So I'm really, really excited about continuing to do this work and help people realise that, you know, you're not going to be the only one, and you will find a community that's there for you.
That's great. It'll be wonderful to work with you over the next year on all of that. That's fantastic. Israel, you have had a somewhat similar experience in maths in terms of being amongst a handful of people from your background. How's that felt for you?
Yeah, that's correct. I'm one of only 2 or 3 people, I think, in my year studying maths. And, you know, it's hard to not feel very conscious of that fact, you know, being one of very few Black people in a sea of white faces. And I think in first year, I definitely struggled with feeling imposter syndrome, feeling like I was just out of place and I'm somehow not supposed to be here. And, you know, even when I'd struggle with maths questions, the first thought that would come to my mind is, am I just not good enough to be here? When every mathematician inevitably struggles with questions. But since then, I've definitely improved in my mindset, and I think I've just been reaffirming to myself that I do deserve to be here. I got the grades just as everyone else did, and even though I might be a minority racially, I definitely deserve to be here. And yeah, it's improved to the point where I'm even hoping to do a master's. So yeah.
Great. That's wonderful. That's a great story. Can I have you step back for a moment? When you were considering coming here, what would have been the things that would both encourage you to think about coming to Cambridge and discourage you?
Yeah. So I think I did visit Cambridge. I think it was in year 10 at some point on a school trip, and you know, I liked the city and thought, wow, it'd be really cool to study here, especially for maths, because historically a lot of really bright mathematicians studied at Cambridge. So that was, I guess, the main encouragement. And in terms of discouragement, I think this is probably true of most people, or most people that I know from my sort of background socioeconomically, is there's a perception, as I'm sure we know, of Cambridge as being for a particular demographic or for a particular class of people. We're talking about the intersectionality between class and race, and also for people who come from a particular place as well. So I think a lot of people, first of all, just don't think it's for them, as in they don't think they would be able to get in, but also they feel like even if they do get in, they wouldn't feel comfortable, or they wouldn't have anyone to relate to. So yeah, there's definitely some discouragements that persist.
So let's pursue that a little bit more. Priscilla, let's think about how to shift those perceptions. You, I think, might have been the only Black student in your year at Girton. Gather you did brilliantly in your degree. Well done. You also, don't mind me mentioning, you have a form of disability, and then you got into student politics, activism, became president of the Cambridge Student Union. It was then called CUSU. What were the changes that you thought were needed? What motivated you to get engaged politically in that way?
Absolutely. And it's something that Israel said that's really struck me, was the idea that every student will struggle, but when you struggle as a Black student, as a student of color, something because of the psyche in some ways tells you that this is somehow to do with your background, as opposed to a natural struggle that everyone would have. And I think for me, so much of the work I did was about trying to normalize the idea that everyone has difficulties, the idea that, you do not have to come to Cambridge and be a representative of all Black people everywhere. You're one student, you're an individual, and you should be able to grow, to change and evolve as an individual and graduate with a fantastic degree. And so for me, as a Black woman, as a partially blind Black woman, it's been incredibly important for me to ensure that those who have the will, more than anything, have the opportunity. And wherever I was at the University of Cambridge, and since really, and hopefully at Harvard starting in August, if I see a space where more people of color should be, but for some reason aren't, I refer to it often as the empty chair theory. Who's here, who should be here, who's not here, and what can we do to get them in the room and at the table? And I did that with the Black Women, the FLY, which is the Network for Women of Color, because if I see a space, I think we should try to fill it. And I think that get-in is part of that very process. Who's not here? Who should be here? How can we get them in the room? So that's my approach.
Brilliantly phrased. Thank you very much. Ibs, you said that you didn't feel that you were out of place academically, and yet you did really work hard while you were here to try to convince others that they would apply. You obviously saw those empty chairs, to use Priscilla's terminology. Why do you think those chairs are there? How do we change the perception?
Yeah, so I think we have to change the perception, because I think for a lot of individuals who come from minority backgrounds, perception and the knowledge gathered through perceptions is all they have. And I think that unfortunately there's a few kind of structural barriers, and I'm not too sure where this Oxbridge vendetta came from, but I think that the current discourse, from the mass media, when they essentially sometimes create moral panics about Oxbridge traditions that can sometimes scare a student from applying. If it's not the media, it could be even teachers who have no relation with Oxbridge before, yet still play a really significant role in gatekeeping applications from students, and also fairly parents and the extended family who, through the word of mouth, can really also build on those perceptions and take that to students to either stop them from applying. And so the research I've done based on my work online and also based on my dissertation is students specifically who come from Asian backgrounds, there seems to be this idea that some universities are not for you. And there seems to be a very big disparity when it comes from parents encouraging males over females from applying and succeeding at Oxbridge. We talked about the issue of class and cultural capital being a big factor as well. So we need to change those perceptions. And my way was through social media by trying to empower students. I created vlogs that were very authentic, very real, very sassy, that tried to convey this is the real Cambridge, not what you always see in the media. So that was one way empowering students. But now how do we empower parents? How do we empower the family? Whose role is that? Is that government? Is that university? And so I think that through tackling perceptions, it really is about empowerment.
Thank you. Zainab, as a Muslim woman, do you think that there are particular sets of issues? Ibs has mentioned maybe some of them, but fitting in with Cambridge as a Muslim woman, how has that been in your experience?
I think it's a really interesting question, because I'm not particularly religious. You know, my Muslim identity is not one that I feel very strongly, but even in my choice of college, I'm at Newnham, it's a women's college, and that was a really important thing for me at the time, because I went to an all-girls school and I've not had much interaction with the opposite gender, and so having Newnham as a space for me felt almost like a safety blanket, because I was able to be in my own space and more comfortable, and that's both, you know, as a woman but as a Muslim woman, and you know, I'm not saying that other colleges don't have that kind of thing, but being able to have a community of Newnham Muslim sisters was really, really nice. That, you know, if I ever did want to do anything more in touch with my Muslim side, that there was a space for that, and it was a real comfort. And I think definitely, like, a lot of what Ibs has said has resonated with me in terms of just perceptions of extended family and things. And you know, I when I got in, one of my aunts said, well, you know, she's got into Cambridge, it's not Durham, she can commute to and from uni every day, so she doesn't have to move out of home. And it's insane to even think that I would be asked to do a 2-hour commute just so I can live at home.
Very interesting. Thank you. Israel, Sam and I were talking about, finances being one of the greatest barriers to participation, full life in the university. I know that you had a Reuben Scholarship in your first year, and that's actually the model that we've used to create the undergraduate awards for Get In. Just give us a flavor as to what that Reuben Scholarship meant to you and your family.
Yeah, absolutely. So my situation was a bit weird in that, although I had grown up here, I wasn't born here, but I grew up here from a young age. Because I didn't have full citizenship at the start of my degree, I wasn't eligible for a student loan from the government. So my parents had to take out loans from family friends, and banks, and yeah, there was a bit of a financial burden. But the Reuben Scholarship was, one of the I suppose quite a few scholarships that are available, or bursaries that are available in Cambridge, that I was lucky enough to get. And yeah, it just helped to mitigate the financial burden, and meant that I didn't have to worry so much about finances. Although there was still a lot of financial pressure, and there still exists, but it definitely did help to mitigate that. And I know friends who, some of whom actually got the student loan, but still have financial burdens. I know some people who even send money back home to help out with costs. And Cambridge is very stressful enough as it is. To have the extra financial pressure is something that really does affect people. And I think we can't underestimate how important finance is in terms of people wanting to come here.
So we have loads of great questions, and I think I better get to them, because I want to make sure that people are respected in offering up these questions. Let's continue on the finance piece, because one of the people who's listening in says that one of the problems they think is that students are often unaware of where they can ask for help financially through the college and the university. For example, joining in some activities may require a payment, and that just may not be available to some students coming from certain backgrounds. Do you have any ideas about how we could do a better better job ensuring that students are aware of where help might be available from a financial perspective? Priscilla?
It's a really good question. I mean, I have a few ideas. I think that it is a wide cultural phenomenon that people find it uncomfortable to talk about money broadly. And as a result, you find that the same thing can sort of seep into, university culture as well. And I know that for me, I was sometimes in a position to send money home from my student loan. And there are a few opportunities that I didn't take while I was at an undergrad. And I think it should be front and center that money is available for students. I think it should be, especially in the collegiate system, some of the difficulties we have is demonstrating that all colleges have access to these certain pots of money. As a Girtonian, money for opportunities outside of day-to-day studying didn't feel as apparent as some of my friends at Keys or Trinity or St. John's. And I think that these central pots of money like Get In, where in fact it's open to every single person, if they are to be really well promoted, people will go and access them, and we can start to tackle this, some of the hesitation someone might have around saying, oh, I'd like to do this thing, but I need the money to do it. It's not a reflection on them as a person, a personal reflection on their talent, their potential, but rather, they need the money to get them to this opportunity. And that should be simple and accessible for everyone.
Ibs, do you have any thoughts on that? Because I know that you did try to give advice around this while you were here vlogging, I should say.
So I think, how do we convince students to, search for the money we do have? And I think in a similar way with the bursary system, almost automatically you are aware of the students who come from low income backgrounds and they're kind of given that bursary automatically. I think we could do something similar as well for the centralized money that we do have. I think that I was entitled to the full bursary and I was very, very grateful for it. And Wolfson College even had an additional top up if you stayed on campus for longer. But that was something that was kind of automatically done through paperwork. And so I think kind of easing the burden away from students to do that independent research, to maybe work with, senior tutors at colleges or work with financial advisors, I think could be a lot more beneficial. Remember, students are already stressed with moving in, the transition of the academic life. So I think just, making it a bit more easier for them just by providing them it straight away through the colleges.
Thank you. Israel, you mentioned earlier that you were now contemplating doing a master's degree, and we've got a couple of our alumni who are doing that or about to do it. Someone's asked here about this sort of financial burden around worrying about funding a master's degree. I mean, how have you processed that in thinking through what your next options are? Is it seen, do you see it as a real barrier, funding for master's programs?
Yeah, definitely. And to be honest, I'm still sort of processing it. Although at the moment, I'm worrying more on the academic side and getting good enough grades. But yeah, I very well will have to think about finances very soon.
And it's not obvious in the way I think our systems are organized. Someone asked earlier in the questions for Sam why we were looking at master's programs and not yet at PhDs. And part of the answer to that is just we have to start somewhere, and masters are shorter term. But the other really important answer is that increasingly the master's is a gateway to the PhD if people want to do it. So we have to find mechanisms to get people to that level so that they are eligible for a PhD. Ibs, can you just say how you found applying for a master's program and the financing around that?
So I was inspired to apply for masters because I had already known that there were organizations who were providing scholarships. So the same way that, the Stormzy Scholarship was a big motivator to push back students applying, my funding body, the Aziz Foundation, which allows kind of bursaries for Muslim students, was a significant driving factor. Because they had already promoted work, I knew 2 years before applying for the masters, I would apply, and for that organization. So the work of donors, which were a really big part of that, helped me significantly in literally raising my aspirations.
That's great, thank you. One of the themes that's emerged in a number of your stories is that there was a teacher who encouraged you, stepped up, but inversely that you're aware of people who were not encouraged by teachers. How do we do a better job reaching down into the pipeline here that gets students to be in a place where they're actually encouraged to think about Cambridge? Zainab, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's really hard because we can't go and talk to every school and access every school in the UK, much less, if we're looking at international access as well. But I think a lot of the work that happens on a collegiate level, like the SLOs and them having link areas to go to, I remember actually the school's liaison officer from Newnham coming to my school because it was just by coincidence, it's a link area. And so a lot of, when I was helping out with interviews, a lot of the students that had applied to Newnham said, oh, we had someone from Cambridge come and talk about Newnham, and that's why I decided to apply here. And so doing more work like that is really important to get certain colleges on the map, and it gives students a bit more in-person interaction with someone from the university.
Thanks. Last word on this to you, Priscilla. Any advice on how best to reach teachers and indeed parents, I think, to help them understand that this is an opportunity for students who are talented and tenacious?
Yeah, I think you're right to say that there should be advice, a wealth of advice for teachers and for parents, because what you find with students who would like to go to the best universities in the world is that, they may be 17, but they are highly, highly motivated. They are, incredibly bright, and they want this. And I think, my parents didn't go to university. Both my mum and my dad did secondary school in Ghana. And I think one thing that I really loved was when I got home on the day of my Insight Day to Cambridge, I said to my mum, oh, I'm going to Cambridge. And she went, okay. And, to her mind, and, she said this to me when I was graduating, she never thought her daughter would ever end up in a place like that. But it was just the willingness to reserve her anxieties about it was hugely important. And the same thing I say to teachers all the time: reserve your anxieties. If this is a student who is showing you their will, help spur them on. And that's not to say don't take their mental health seriously if they're pushing themselves too hard, but teaching students how to exercise discipline around their working practices, how often they work, how hard they're working, how smart they're working, is part of the life skills that a teacher should be teaching a student anyway. And so with that, I would say, be their cheerleader. Promote them wherever you can and show them that, at least to you don't have a question about what they can achieve. That would be my advice.
Great advice. I wish we could go on. This is a great conversation, and I can't tell you how inspiring it is for me to be able to talk with you as graduates and as students at this university. Boy, what a source of pride. But we've run out of time, and I'm sorry we couldn't answer everybody's question, but thank you, Zainab, Priscilla, Israel, and Ibrahim Ibs. Great to talk with you. You've just been wonderful, and I want to thank Sam Jima again for his really, really thoughtful contribution. Finally, my profound thanks to all of you for your engagement with Cambridge. Thank you to those of you who've been working to make Get In the success it already is. And I hope that you've enjoyed hearing about the importance of Get In and how it can really change perceptions and remove financial barriers. And I'm really hopeful that with your continuing support and generosity, it will transform lives. Thanks for joining us. Take care and stay safe.